Okay. Things set up here. Awesome. Well, hello everybody. Welcome everyone to our panel on Indigenous climate justice. We have a lot prepared to discuss today with our three wonderful speakers, so I'll try to keep this intro short. This panel will be about 2 hours long, and we'll have a short 5-minute break at the 1 hour mark around 7 p.m. The last half hour of the event will be reserved for audience questions. My name is Sophia, one of the organizers for this panel. I represent the University College Literary and Athletic Society here at U of T. UC Lit Sustainability is a climate advocacy student group aiming to actively engage our constituents within University College, as well as students within U of T. We do this through mainly trying to get people more politically engaged in relevant issues in climate justice and environmental activism. If you're a UC student or U of T student, we aren't picky, UC Lit Sustainability is a great way to get involved in climate action work. Our chat mods will put some contact info into the chat right now, and we will be including them in our list of webinar resources following the event. For our audience members, please keep your microphones muted for the duration of the event to minimize any background noise for us. And please use the chat to ask any questions you may have for our speakers. Our chat moderators, Sarah, Karina, and Neha, you guys can wave. We'll note them down and we'll save these questions for the last half hour of the webinar. They will also be posting links and resources into the chat, as you can see, throughout the event. And to view only the speakers on your screen as they speak, you can toggle to speaker view in the top right corner of your screen. If anyone has any technical difficulties during the event, please feel free to message our chat mods privately and they will do their best to assist you. Some accessibility notes: we absolutely do not tolerate any hateful or discriminatory behavior at this event. If any of this should happen, our chat mods will deal with the issue accordingly. And this webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the UC Lit YouTube channel with closed captions available for asynchronous viewing. The link to our YouTube channel will be posted in the chat. We'll also post in the Facebook event page for this webinar when the recording is uploaded, along with a compilation of any resources mentioned during the webinar. So that's about it for housekeeping. Moving on, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We're grateful that with video conferencing, we're able to bring this panel to a wider audience of people from many different places. Our groups are based in a city called Toronto, and many viewers may have ties to this place, so I'm going to talk about it for this land acknowledgement. This place we call Toronto has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years. The name Toronto has its origins in a word in the Wendat language that refers to a type of dam used for fishing. For millennia, this land was an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples to engage in seasonal fishing activities, commerce, and cultural exchange. And for this reason, this word that named our city has taken on other meanings in diverse Indigenous languages, meanings such as the gathering place. So even in the naming of our city, we can see that this place was and still is an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples. This land has been inhabited by the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations. In the Dish with One Spoon, the dish is the land around the Great Lakes with all of its resources, and each of us has just one spoon with which to eat. By using the spoon to take only what we need, we leave land and resources for others to enjoy as we all work together to secure the livelihoods of future generations. The issue of environmental justice roots from the fact that the effects of environmental change aren't distributed evenly. Because of colonialism, racism, systemic equality, and so on, inequality and so on, there are folks who are many times more vulnerable to the catastrophic and cascading environmental and social effects of climate change and its consequences. The environmental movement of the past has again and again failed to recognize this and often takes a colorblind approach to advocating for Earth's rehabilitation, often leaving many human lives behind. Today, as a part of learning from such mistakes, we must partake in a joint stewardship with Indigenous peoples in our journey of restoring this land. As an uninvited guest and Chinese second-gen immigrant on this land, I commit and implore those of you watching to active listening, caring, and advocating as the best allies as we can be for Indigenous autonomy and land sovereignty. Canada's long history of cultural genocide has resulted in profound Indigenous suffering, and we must act as an angry agent for change and accountability for the greater institutions that continue to perpetrate harm upon people and land. We cannot move forward until Indigenous narratives and perspectives are centered and prioritized. If you'd like to learn more about the Indigenous history of Toronto, an excellent overview was published in issue number 1 of U of T's First Nations House magazine. The link will be posted in the chat shortly. So moving on, our speakers can give themselves a short little introduction. I will start with Eve, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Yeah, sure. Hello, hi everyone. My name is Eve Saint and I'm a Wet'suwet'en land defender. I was raised in Toronto and I was one of the 4 that got arrested last February 2020, the RCMP invasion on Wet'suwet'en territory. I am the daughter of one of the hereditary house chiefs, Was. Some of you may have seen him seen him interact with Carolyn Bennett and Mark Miller, like demand to be sat down at the table. So he was one of those people. And yes, I am currently in Six Nations with my 6-month-old daughter, Cassia. Thank you.
Great, thank you for being here today. Next we have Jayce.
Hello everyone, welcome. Anin Minande Beneshi Kwe Indigenous Kitganzi Bin Donjaba Gigo Dodam Anishinaabe Kwendao Port Moody Dinda. So I just told you my spirit name is Bluebird Woman. I'm Fish Clan. My name is Jayce Chiblow and I'm from Garden River First Nation, which is actually located in central, kind of northern Ontario, depending on where you're from. It's in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. I did live in Toronto for quite some time, but I now live in Port Moody and Coast Salish territories just outside of Vancouver. So I just wanted to pay respects to that. And note that, you know, we might all be coming in from different territories, so to make sure that you build those relationships with those peoples and the land in a good way. So I want to say miigwech to Sophia for that very well-rounded land acknowledgement. That was great. And I work for Indigenous Climate Action as the community engagement lead, and I also work for the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project at York University as the project coordinator. So hello, everyone.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but not least, we have Lee.
Muted here. Hi, how are you doing? I'm from that end of town. You know, Port Moody is right near Coquitlam, and it's actually named after an ancestor who didn't quite understand what the English were asking him. They said, "What do you call this place?" And he thought, "What do you call me?" So he said, "Coquitlam," and Coquitlam is best they could do. So that's how Coquitlam got its name, then Port Coquitlam, then Port Moody, and so on and so forth. I was raised there with people who weren't grown-ups when they first saw white people. So white people haven't been in British Columbia that long, and I have been around for quite a while. And I noticed that your biography doesn't have any of my later works here. It's about 25 years old, probably because you got it from the internet, but there you go. I'm all right with that. I have a number of books since those last ones that you noted. And I've also want to say that I've won a number of awards. I think it's important if you're an author to mention that, particularly if you're Indigenous, so that other Indigenous kids can say, well, maybe I can make a living at it. And I know that there's just been a flood of wonderful young Indigenous writers since I've been saying that. The other thing is the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon. It's my understanding from the elders I know here that it begins at Blockade and ends in Fort Erie, goes up to Simcoe, and that it's the Anishinaabes refer to themselves, the Anishinaabes and their allies, the Odawas, and I can't remember the other group, but anyway, and the Haudenosaunee people, they made that treaty, and it does form the foundation for treaties that came later. It is the first treaty in Ontario, which is beautiful and of the most beautiful lake. There you go.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you three for taking the time to be here. We are very appreciative and honored to have you share your thoughts and experiences with us. So without further ado, let's jump right into our questions. So the first set of questions we have are kind of general, kind of going into what each of our speakers do and kind of what their work involves. So our first question is actually for you, Lee. So what is, in your opinion, kind of the intersection between your work as an author and storytelling and Indigenous climate justice?
These are such complicated questions. You know, storytelling, I think people think of storytelling as someone getting up and telling a story, but that's not how it goes in Stalo territory. There's masked dancers, there's people singing, there's, you know, speakers intervening, and the audience is intervening, and the story gets zigged and zagged around. And so it's a very exciting event, and it's hours and hours long. So that's our storytelling tradition. It's really different from what you think of as storytelling. So when I'm doing a novel, like Celia's Song, which isn't on your list, but Raven's Song is, those two novels have a tidal rhythm to them because our music has a tidal rhythm. And we are very much about the water and the wind. So there's also a lot of breathiness. And I remember one Anishinaabe woman saying, well, I don't like reading Raven's Song or Celia's Song because it feels like sometimes you plunge me into deep water, and that terrifies me. So, so there's that too. There is depth to the story. And I weave in and out of things. I'm also a weaver. Salish weavers are famous throughout the world, and I'm one of them. So, you know, I do that. And I think that those things come together in everything that I do, whether it's an essay or a story or a novel. I don't make the difference between one and the other. So sometimes in Raven's Song, you'll read some of the political things going on almost like it's an essay, you know, or it's oratory, or it's, what is this? I remember one white guy asking who was reviewing it, what is this? Sometimes he just come across some passage, he couldn't figure out what's going on here. So all of these things mingle and mix in my life. I don't know about intersect though, because an intersection is this, right? And now I think everything in the earth intersects. If you think of the earth as the globe, the humans, the sky, the birds, the animals, all of these things intersect for me. That's what intersects, not necessarily what I do. I hope that is sufficient.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful answer to that. So our next question is for Eve. You are a Wet'suwet'en land defender who was one of the 4 arrested at Gitdimdim camp last February. Can you tell us more about what happened with the Wet'suwet'en land dispute and your experiences from the front lines of land defense?
Yes, for sure. Going back to January 4th, 2020, I just happened to be visiting my family in Burns Lake, and we got the news that that Coastal GasLink has received the permanent injunction. And actually I was waiting, and a lot of other people like Freda, Molly, and everyone was waiting for that decision to come in. So I just so happened to be there at that time. And I was on my winter holidays. I was at CIT, Center for Indigenous Theater. And so we went to the territory. My dad was like, we're going, we got to go. And I had to make a quick decision. I had to make a decision to, let's say, leave my life in Toronto and, you know, stay, because I knew that if I got back on that plane to Toronto and like allow another raid to happen on Wet'suwet'en territory without me being there, I would never be able to live with myself. So I ended up staying, leaving my life. And January 4th, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs evicted CGL. And I keep on saying, so sorry. But
Yeah, we're so polite.
Okay, and then so that day, it was so powerful because we had 35 days land back. We had no heavy machineries or no white trucks driving up and down the roads, intimidating the people, the women, even the children that are there. And so for me, I haven't like dropped my life like that to be on the front lines like that. So, I was going through a lot. I was going through a lot of fear because I knew what was coming, because we all seen what happened in the first raid in 2019, and what with Molly and the 14 who got arrested at Gidimden, the first raid. So I knew, I had an idea of what was coming, and I knew I had to stay. I knew that it was so important that it's not an easy thing to do, because there wasn't a lot of people with us. As you can see, there's 4 of us that actually stood that day, at Gidimden, and then there was the matriarchs in Unistoten territory, and then there's other camps that made a stand. But it's not an easy thing. You really have to dedicate and actually psych yourself up and commit, I guess. Not a lot of people do, because a lot of people have to work. A lot of people have children. So I was able to walk away from my life and make that stand. Anyway, so what happened? Yeah, we were counting down the days. We were counting down the days when we would get a lot of RCMP helicopters like flying overhead. We had to turn off the internet. We had to, hide, because they were obviously trying to surveil, see how many numbers and who's there, etc. And then we also had that illegal blockade that they put up. And so we saw that they had a checkpoint in Wet'suwet'en territory. So now the RCMP is controlling who goes in and out of the territory. And we're talking about Wet'suwet'en people. We're talking about Indigenous people on our own lands. And so a lot of people have pointed out that it's like the pass system all over again. And if people aren't familiar with the pass system, back in when Indigenous people were put on reserves, that we weren't allowed to leave the reserve. We weren't allowed to be free on our land, to roam free on our territories. And so this is exactly what is happening. I can tell you right now that Wet'suwet'en territories is a police state. It is very heavily policed. What we experience, numerous helicopters, and also like RCMP trying to get as far as they can. I know that there's the buildup of the 100 RCMP coming in, so that's what kind of we knew was coming. And so we're like, what do we do? Because we had to think, like, how are we going to do this? Because we're peaceful, we're unarmed, and we want to try to hold ground as long as we can, right? Because we're talking about holding off genocide. We're talking about holding off the pipeline, man camps, racist white Canadian males coming into the territory, and especially along the Highway of Tears, Highway 16. That's where Wet'suwet'en territory is, and where this pipeline is going to be going through. And so we were trying to keep that out. So we're trying to think of generations ahead. We're trying to think of that's why I made that stand there. That's why I dropped everything. I thought about the lives that are at stake. And so it happened. Camp 37 or 39 got raided. The cops, RCMP went in, violent, pushing, shoving, dragging people, Indigenous people off the territory. And we knew that it was coming. It wasn't the next day, but it was the day after. And I just remember, like, you don't freeze from fear, because you got to keep on going. And I just remember, like, I had to hold me and my partner, Shiloh, who's with me, and Anne and Denzel, who I don't know if anybody remembers the bus and the little tower. So we had Anne and Denzel up on the tower, and then me and my partner down on the ground. And I didn't think about it at the time, but I was supposed to be in the bus. But holding my ground out there actually kept them at bay for as long as we can. And then all of a sudden helicopters come like flying overhead real fast, black helicopters dropping TAC teams, canines and SWATs. And we had what do you call it, snipers, like in the bushes pointing guns at us, and you could feel it. Like, we couldn't see it because they're camouflaged and they go around, so you could just feel guns pointed at you. And all of a sudden you hear behind, they're behind, and you see you know, like the RCMP forming. And I kept on saying that we're unarmed, that's it. Like, we're peaceful, we have every right to be here, you're committing genocide, you're the ones who are violent, you're the ones with the guns, you're the ones who are destroying, like, the earth, and we're doing this for your children. It's not just for us, it's not just for our people. And standing with Indigenous resistance, it's because it's us whose territories are invaded. And so it's pretty intense time. And I don't want to take, it was probably one of the hardest things in my life I had to go through. Got like post-traumatic stress from that. I found out 2 days before the raid I was pregnant with my daughter, and I had to ask my daughter. I was like, you know, if I asked her in the future, like, should I stay or not? And I know that she would say, you stay. So I had to make that difficult decision, and I'm glad I did, because we saw shut down Canada. All right. Okay, enough.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer. I can't imagine how much of a scary experience that must have been. So thank you so much for all the work that you did and are doing. Our last question is for Jayce, kind of pivoting here. What is kind of the intersection between your work with food systems justice and food sovereignty and Indigenous advocacy?
Yeah, sure. I just want to first acknowledge that, Eve, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know that that could have been very traumatic for you, one, to live through, but then also to share that again. So I want to acknowledge your bravery and strength, and thank you for sharing your story. It's always great to hear. And, you know, the thing about Indigenous advocacy that I think is the most important is having those kinds of voices on these kinds of talks where they can share their own words and really advocate for themselves, why they were doing those things, what kind of things came up for them while they were experiencing that. So I would just want to, yeah, definitely say thanks to Eve for mentioning all of that and being so brave. For me, you know, food justice and food sovereignty are definitely interrelated with a lot of Indigenous advocacy work. I have a hard time pronouncing that word. But just so that folks that maybe don't know the definition of food justice, it's a holistic and a structural view of food systems that sees healthy food as a human right and works to address structural barriers to that right. Food sovereignty is, you know, there's many definitions, and I know there's a question about this later, so I'll kind of keep it simple, but it's about Indigenous nations reclaiming or revisiting their ways of harvesting foods, whatever that looks like. So for some nations, that's gardening. For some nations, that is learning to trap and hunt. For some nations, that could be you know, harvesting berries and medicines. It can look different for every community, and I think it's really important to know that whatever we as Indigenous people identify as our food systems, you know, it has to be self-determined, is basically that's the most important thing when it comes to the food justice and the food systems work, is allowing Indigenous people to identify what those are and how they want to build those relationships with those beings. So for us, my understanding from what I've learned in my research was that in my territory, I had to build the relationship with the rabbit first. I asked the trapper to teach me, I was like, oh, I want to learn how to harvest a moose. And he was like, no, you need to relax and slow down. You need to learn like a rabbit first. So he took me out, and I was really lucky to be able to go out and learn how to trap rabbits and how to harvest those. And, you know, basically farm to table, like not really farm, but like bush to table, I guess you could say, because we were out in our territory. And I think some of the greatest things that I learned about that experience is how important it is for me as an Indigenous young person, but just as an Indigenous person in general, is to build healthy, strong relationships with my lands and territories. You know, I learned some of the traditional names for some of the territories that we were trapping in that I never would have known had I not spent all of those hours. It was quite a lot of effort with that elder. He doesn't like being called an elder, with that knowledge keeper slash you know, trapper person that was sharing that knowledge. And I just want to also note that if you do plan on building relationships with Indigenous peoples, that you really have to put in that time. You know, I spent years with this person before I started my research, because he did end up playing like a big role. He was at my workshop that I hosted. And I find that now I'm like advocating for him so much, and like he gave me permission, of course, but it's because I built that relationship, and he wants to make sure that I'm, you know, the things that I learned I'm applying to my everyday life and I'm bringing into the work that I do. So for me, food justice is using systems that are sustainable, that are local, and that support Indigenous relationships. So for example, out here, for my work with ICA, we're doing a package for all of our staff. And what we went through is all local Indigenous owned businesses. And that's something that I think is really important when you're doing this work, is to support Indigenous folks and uplift people like Eve and Lee that are doing the work here, and make sure that they have the space to be able to be as open and free and safe when they're sharing these stories. Because true Indigenous advocacy is using our voices and uplifting our voices and making sure that, you know, our thoughts and our responsibilities and our ideas are at the core center of things like food sovereignty and food justice and climate justice as well, just the broader environmental justice movement in general.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that work that you're doing, definitely. Our next section is going to be on more discussing like the more systemic violence against Indigenous communities within the last very long time. So going back to Eve, how has the Wet'suwet'en and other Indigenous solidarity protests impacted pipeline construction progress? And can you talk about how issues such as pipeline construction kind of play a role in perpetuating that cycle of violence against Indigenous peoples?
Yes. Okay, so I believe that direct action is very effing important. We're in a system that does not honor Indigenous people. They do not honor our territories, our treaties, our women, our children, and we cannot allow, we cannot just be like submissive, or we can't just allow. And there are people out there who say no, like Molly, Freda, Kanahus, Line 3, all these people, all these Indigenous people taking a stand. And that's what we have to do. We have to shake the core. Like we have to shake the system. We have to say no, and we do have power. And we saw that with Shut Down Canada. We saw that with the raids that happened, that we were there, no weapons, peaceful, no violence. CGL got evicted, and that really disrupted their work. Like we costed them a lot of money. We costed the RCMP a lot of money with all their surveillance, and actually we were successful because 100 RCMP for 4 unarmed Indigenous people, like on one day. So they, so I really feel like these direct actions are very impactful, and they should be, and we have to actually raise the bar. We have to keep on doing them. Like look at Land Back Lane here in Six Nations. Like they're over 150 days. You know, they dug it up. They dug up the roads. Yeah, like there was no way that the OPP was getting in there. right? Like I know that they had to make some compromises with the community to open up some roadways, but right, like we have to do what we need to do. Like if it's just destroying a couple streets or whatever, like look at our people how you know went through over the past 500 years plus, right? You can be a little inconvenienced if you're like waiting for half an hour in traffic jam because somebody took over the street to try to get your attention. So I find it very effective. I mean, especially with our Indigenous kin all over Turtle Island, and how we came together and, shut down stuff in our territories like CN Rail or highways. You try to hit them where it hurts, like investors. We have to let the Canadian state know that we are human, we have power, and we are here, and we deserve decency, we deserve clean water, we deserve to not feel like we're gonna get killed walking down the side of on the sidewalk, or our children won't get sex trafficked, or our men won't get beaten up and taken on the side and left on side of the highway with no shoes on. And also it's a long fight because it's everywhere. System in what do you call it, institutional racism, that it's everywhere in the healthcare system, in law enforcement, in the justice system. Like this whole system, this whole Canadian structure is built to oppress us. And we can't use their tools to win against them, right? So we have to find other ways. We have to come up with creative ways. And yes, actually there can be some progress, like educational wise, academic wise, lawyer wise, yes, but we do have to try all the avenues. And as we witnessed shutting down Canada, we were able to get government officials to the table. I really don't like Carolyn Bennett at all. I really do not like that person. That person is a snake. And that's exactly what happened with the negotiations. There was negotiations to try to get the power back into hereditary chief decision-making and governance. Because there was a difference. That was a whole conflict because the hereditary chief system has say over the land and territory and resources, as opposed to the band council, chief and council on the reserve. So that was the conflict, and that was the confusion. And so anyway, going back to that, that was the whole negotiation, and it just kind of, COVID happened, and then also it kind of just went loose. So I don't even have like a full what happened, what was the whole meeting about. Like I kind of asked for an update, and they just said that there was some supposed to be a memorandum of understanding, and it kind of was only one-sided. Like even Carolyn Bennett and Mark Miller were not budging on what was agreed. Anyway, so, even though, we feel like it seems like CGL won, or it feels like the Canadian government won, or etc., but I do not think that at all. I see a lot of victories in what had happened with the Wet'suwet'en and shut down Canada. There was a lot of people standing up together, coming together. We are very powerful together as nations, as Indigenous people, and I really feel that we still have that power, and we can access that. We have that within us, and yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll let that go. I don't want to talk too much.
No, not at all. That was fantastic. It's interesting that you kind of bring up COVID, because I think we had a webinar earlier in the year that talked about how COVID made it I'm not sure. I think it was like in Alberta or something where they passed legislation super sneakily that made it like harder, if not impossible, for pipeline protests
Yeah.
just in the summer. And it's just great because they're just, you know, using COVID and then just, yeah, it's not good. On a related note, Lee, our next question is for you. We understand that some of your work explores Indigenous feminism and reclaiming sovereignty amidst colonial violence. So this is, again, probably a very complicated question, but kind of what are the, again, intersections between violence against women and violence against the earth? And what are the strengths and leadership roles of Indigenous women within the climate crisis? Oh, Lee, I think you're muted.
I think Indigenous women have been severely weakened by colonization. Let's really be clear. I have no problem with Carolyn Bennett, but I tell you that she represents colonization. I have a problem with colonization. I don't give a shit if it's Trudeau or Carolyn or the RCMP or whoever. It's not personal, people. You represent something horrific. You represent the death of Indigenous people, the disempowerment of Indigenous women, and the rape of the land. Get with the program. Figure out what you want to do and what kind of country you want, and then get out of what you're doing and do something else. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the RCMP were struck up to oppress and contain Indigenous people and to block national self-determination during Riel's time. Nothing has changed about that. So that's the second thing. This is patriarchy, and it's white patriarchy. White men make the money, and we get 55 cents on the dollar if we're educated. But we're at the bottom of the scale of things. Yeah, we have to know that it's colonialism. I don't know if you read the exchange between Trudeau and the newly retired Senator Sinclair, but Trudeau said, well, if you do whatever we're doing, then you are part of the ruling culture. You know, you don't have any business saying anything. And Sinclair lambasted, and that first of all, colonization and decolonization is about the land. So that's what you're doing. You're picking up your responsibility to the land. Now, here's the thing I know about all of us as women, and this is where the violence intersects. Nits breed lice. Custer said that. Yeah, so kill the women because they're going to have children. That was the intent of colonization and its relation to Indigenous women. Nothing's changed. Thousands of women on that trail of tears, we call it, have been killed by settlers and others. You know, I'm not going to say RCMP, but you know, I'm sure they're in there somehow, because people have been beat up for even suggesting that they are colluding with the killers. So not going to do that. But we need to take up our position as women. And we were the heads of households. And I know that I was called Dema when I was small, and that means brat. And my elders were proud of that, because that meant that I would grow up to run a household of 1,500 people, a longhouse, a big house. And I would have the bravery, the bravado, the schmaltz, the chutzpah, or whatever you want to call it, to do that. It turns out that there's a lot of things on my way. Canada, for one. So we got to move that out of the way. That's just what we have to do. And, you know, when Trudeau said what he said, Sinclair responded with, this is colonization and it's about the land, all of you. And then we'll start again and have a conversation. That's what has to happen. We have to get them out of the territory. We have to stop the RCMP. And I think Canadians are responsible for participating in the stopping of the RCMP from invading the Wet'suwet'en people. That's just what their responsibility is as settlers. Otherwise, they're part of the problem. They're the colonizer. They become the same as the RCMP, and that's a violence. The invasion of a people, the removal of their children, the destruction of their land, their food sources, the women, this is all violence. And so pushing back on it, Indigenous women pushing back on it, is a response and an opposition to violence. So there's a direct connection between the violence to the earth that's going on all over the globe and violence to women. There's a direct connection. I actually did a video on that. It's on YouTube if you want to see it, but somebody asked me to do it from Port Nelson. Angus the Kichuan, we called him that. He asked me to do a thing on violence against women. There's a direct connection. It's a single earth, and we all intersect. And if you have violence against women, it's going to be violence against earth as well, because Pachamama is a woman. The earth is a woman. If you're violent to the earth, you're violent to women. And they know it. They're aware of it. They're conscious of it. They got no excuse for not doing what they're doing, for stopping. So opposition to the RCMP as a force of colonial violence toward Indigenous people. That's what I think Canadians need to be doing.
Definitely, for sure. That is very well said. Moving back to Jayce, can you tell us more about your work with Indigenous food sovereignty, and just, what is it and why is it important? I know you went over this a little bit earlier, but never hurts to rehash it.
I saved a little bit just for this part because I knew it was coming. Indigenous food sovereignty is relative. It's not new. Let me just say that it's not a new idea. It's not a new concept, but it is newer in the academic sense. And a lot of the work that I did was actually based off of Dawn Morrison's research that she did with her community and the elders in her community. And that's the framework that I used. And so for Indigenous food sovereignty, it is definitely us self-determining our foods, building our relationships with the food, and those beings. But also there's, for Dawn Morrison's framework, there was 4 main parts, like 4 working pieces to either work towards or achieve Indigenous food sovereignty. And I just wanted to mention those because they're very important, I think. And one of them is sacred or divine sovereignty, which is the understanding that food is a gift from the creator. And in this respect, the right to food is sacred and shouldn't be constrained or recalled by colonial laws, policies, institutions. It's this Indigenous food sovereignty is achieved by upholding our sacred responsibility to nurture those healthy relationships with the lands, plants, animals that provide us with our food. And to just briefly mention, the constraint by colonial laws and colonial systems and colonial governments. I can only speak to my territory specifically, but I'm sure this is happening in many ways to all of the Indigenous peoples in Canada. Thinking about the pipeline and how destructive that is. In my territory, the government, the Ministry of Forest, M&R, Ministry of Resources, Forestry, one of those ones. They'll keep changing their names. They actually, and Health Canada is in on this too, but they allow the aerial herbicide spraying in our territory. And it's glyphosate is the chemical that they use, and that chemical kills basically everything except for certain kinds of pine trees. And that is because that pine tree is the most valuable. So they're creating plantations of trees in our territory. And when I go up in the bush, you can find areas where there's literally everything's dead. And this chemical kills things like tobacco, sweetgrass, berries, birch trees, which are very important for medicine and canoe building if you're a birch bark canoe person, and like so many other things. So when you go back in that bush, you're trying to build up those relationships. You kind of have to worry, are they there? How is this affecting the animals? What kind of health impacts am I going to have on my body if I'm harvesting and eating these foods? And I just wanted to note that because this is happening actually in more than just Ontario. It's happening also in BC. There's also a big movement there. And I just wanted to also give a shout out to the traditional ecological knowledge elders, the TK elders from my territory, that they do all of this work to try and stop the aerial herbicide spraying that's happening in my region. And basically it's happening almost all of Northern Ontario. basically just above Sudbury. Once you hit Sudbury, they start spraying it, but below and in a ton of other regions, they don't. So just noticing that colonial governments are allowing this to happen and aren't properly engaging with Indigenous peoples that are saying, no, we don't want this. We don't want this in our territory. We want to have healthy relationships with our land. And so for the second one of those key points of Indigenous food sovereignty and working towards it is it's participatory or more action-based. So that's the day-to-day practice of maintaining those harvesting strategies. It's a living reality for both present and future generations. This continued participation occurs in many different forms. You know, it can as the individual, so as me going out onto the land and harvesting those animals, but also as my family. You know, me and my mom went out and we had a great time and had lots of laughs and shared knowledge with each other. I mean, mostly her sharing it with me, but, you know, and then community level, right? That was that elder, he doesn't like being called an elder, that knowledge keeper that was sharing that information with us, being so generous and so kind. And then, you know, also the medicine people that I was so lucky to spend time with that were sharing that knowledge. And then there's also regional levels. So, you know, you can think of it as your treaty territory or however you associate yourself with the land. I do, in our territory, we use the Robertson Huron Treaty territory as how we relate, but then you can also do it at the level of your nation. So for example, the Anishinaabe Nation. And for future generations, right, I was taught to think 7 generations ahead, which is really hard to do, thinking about that and making decisions in your everyday life, thinking that far into the future. It really humbles me. And then a third one is the self-determination. So the ability for communities to respond to our own needs for healthy, culturally appropriate foods, and to be able to make decisions over the amount and quality of the food that we harvest, that we fish, that we gather, we grow, and we eat. So, you know, the freedom from dependence on grocery stores or corporately controlled food production, distribution, and consumption. And the last one is policy. I know that some people, I know there's a lot of arguments that policy isn't an answer, but this is one that, you know, that it's, I mean, I'm hopeful that one day we can get to the point where policy is great and works for Indigenous people, but this frame is attempting to reconcile Indigenous food and cultural values with colonial laws and policies and mainstream economic activities. So this would provide a restorative framework for policy reform in things like forestry, like I mentioned, fisheries, rangeland, environmental conservation, health, agricultural, basically all of the things, and just, you know, centering Indigenous knowledge in that and centering Indigenous voices in that. Because I think that's really important to create meaningful change. Indigenous people need to be at the table. They need to determine how they want to be at the table, what that engagement looks like. Because currently the experiences that I've had haven't been too great with the engagement itself. You know, free, prior, and informed consent is huge, and that should be the norm across the board. But unfortunately, in my territory, you know, these chemicals are being sprayed without our consent. What happened was specifically was someone from my community attended the meeting, and basically they put him on the forest management plan as a contributor, and he doesn't know how to get his name off of there because he's like, I just went there to learn about what they were doing. I didn't want to, you know, speak for my community, but unfortunately that was the way that the government took it. And that was, you know, now that's how they're justifying the continued spraying in our territory. So just noticing that colonial violence, like Lee said, there is colonial violence when it comes to our food systems, and it really restricts our ability as young people, as myself anyway, to build those relationships when the animals can't, they have to leave because there's no food. And then therefore I can't build those relationships with those animals and learn about those animals and their responsibilities. And then in turn, also my responsibilities as an Indigenous person.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Actually, right on time. We're going to take a 7-minute break until 7 p.m. and we'll see everyone back here. Feel free to, you know, grab some water, grab a snack, and we'll pick up at 7. Alrighty. We'll get started back up again. So our next section is going to be on public narratives, media, and communication. So we'll start with you, Jayce. You are the project coordinator at the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project over at York. Can you tell us more about this project, its aims and its missions, and your work there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the link in the chat. Feel free to check out. We just hosted some great events this weekend. It is very Anishinaabe focused. We had like a language event this past weekend. and we're starting a climate justice / climate change series this is it spring right now? I don't know, like coming up now anyway, this semester, this academic term. The IEJ project does a lot of work. We do a lot of events trying to share knowledge, but we also do more of the academic research side. So the main goal of the project is to kind of, you know, take that narrative back. The environmental justice movement that hasn't really had a whole lot of Indigenous input. So part of the goal of the project, you know, it started about 5 or 6 years ago, was to create our own narrative and really have Indigenous folks identify what justice means to them, what environmental justice means to them, and why that's so important for us to move forward. And the project itself does things like annotated bibliographies, events, reports, and sharing a lot of resources and amplification of Indigenous voices and Indigenous movements. My work there is kind of just to help organize things and organize events, assist in the research. So in interviews, eventually we will have papers coming out based off of those interviews that we've done. But I find what most people enjoy the most are our online events. So they are very helpful for people in the Toronto area that want to learn more about Indigenous folks, Indigenous environmental justice. The project's going to take a turn because climate justice has become so important and is so key to Indigenous survival that and this is where the research led us, was when we were doing interviews, people kept mentioning, you know, climate justice. So we started to do more research into that, and we're going to kind of shift ourselves over into more of the climate justice realm. And part of my role was my research project. So what I did was I hosted a workshop in my community, and I wanted to ask the youth in my community, you know, what their opinions are on climate change and environmental justice, and what kind of things do our community need to create? What kind of programs or offerings do we need to give for youth to feel safe and to feel like they're culturally safe, emotionally safe, and well? And what happened was, it was a great event. We did a workshop style, and, you know, I learned my lesson. Of course, I did the like academic stuff at the beginning. So I was like, oh, here's all the questions. And they all just like stared at me like, what? Like, we don't care. And then as we started doing the work, so I brought that person that I was talking about, those knowledge keepers, the trapper and the medicine people. Once we started harvesting some animals, so we brought some beaver. We had what is that called? We had a couple animals anyway. We had a rabbit, and we had the youth actually help us skin those and harvest those animals. And that's when the actual stuff started to come out, when they really started to share like what they were looking for and what kind of programs they wanted so that they could learn these things. And it was pretty amazing seeing them learn and see them realize, like, I really want to learn how to do this. I want to be able to do this like without my parents' help. And then I also work for Indigenous Climate Action. I just wanted to mention, you know, ICA does a lot of work. It's more of a national level, so all across so-called Canada, supporting folks that are doing the frontline direct action work, but also supporting language initiatives, food sovereignty work, basically whatever we're asked to do and whatever the community, Indigenous communities and nations say are the key important work. So as of recently, if you're ever interested in what ICA is doing, we have like a toolkit coming out, so a resource. And that's my main role, is to facilitate that resource and that program so that Indigenous folks can learn about the research that Indigenous Climate Action did with communities, which was focused on, you know, Indigenous narratives to climate change, Indigenous solutions to climate change. And basically the whole point of ICA is to uplift Indigenous voices, but also to create our own Indigenous climate experts and leaders. So building capacity in communities is huge for us, and that's something that we're planning on doing. And I just also want to mention really quickly that recently we did a nationwide youth needs assessment with a partner through Oxford University, and I would highly recommend, if you have the time, reading that over, because it was Indigenous youth that filled out this survey and participated in the workshop, identifying what they needed to participate in climate action work, what kind of things they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it, and what kind of supports they needed. So I think it's really important when we talk about advocacy is to look at reports like that, where it's, you know, kind of summarizing what all of those young people said and all of their important and very valid points that they brought to the movement and how they want to show up in a good way. So I just highly recommend to check out that resource and check out the website and do what you can, even if it's just following and reading and learning more. that's still a good first step for some folks, because I know not all of us can start this kind of work or start a direct action as easily as others. So, you know, just building up that training and building up that capacity in communities is basically what ICA focuses on right now.
Fantastic. Yeah, so I sent some links as you were talking about them into the chat, so audience members, feel free to check that out. So pivoting back over to Eve, you mentioned in an event at actually New College at U of T last March that we need Indigenous voices rather than mainstream media to tell stories, since mainstream media will often misconstrue and bend stories in favor of industry and the government. So can you expand more on this and tell us about how kind of greater governmental powers often distort public media to the detriment of Indigenous peoples and their narratives?
Yes. So media and I guess in the entertainment industry, as we can all see, is very powerful. It's very powerful and very influential, especially to the youth and younger people. And also, like, there's also a history of how media was used in order to try to control people or try to, like, it serves one purpose, really. Media is to help white supremacy stay in power. You know, there's all these stereotypes or stereotypical prejudices against Native people, like, you know, we're alcoholics and, you know, we're all homeless or this and that, but there's no like history context. They try to keep that hidden. And so they keep these racial borders up. And so the thing is with Shutdown Canada, I noticed in the media, they always did a poll and they're like, who do you support? Do you support Indigenous people or do you support the Wet'suwet'en or do you support industry? And so there's always a 50-50. And so I know with mainstream Canada is that they do not know our history. They do not know Canada's dirty little secret of residential schools and like the Indian Act or their ways to oppress us and their land theft, etc. And so it really benefits them to have power over that narrative that, you know, not to have our truth spoken. So a lot of time we're silenced, even we're not credible, like our voices, or because, you know, sometimes we're very oral people, our knowledge are sent through teachings, ceremony, storytelling, and relationships. And so we're not seen as credible or equal, and our history, our voices have no value. And so I seen if a lot of our history is spoken or taught from our own voices and validated and received and believed, like, we would get a lot of support. There's a lot of racial discrimination towards First Nations people, and a lot of people don't know. There's a lot of ignorance out there because a lot of the time it's learned maybe from their parents or someone in their family. Racism is passed on or passed down. And so I really strongly believe amplifying our voice. That's what I do with my social media. Like when I'm out on the front line, is I do lives, or I try to get out there. I try to, like, you know, get people to speak, or youth to speak, or other people to speak, because I just don't want to be the person speaking, right? I think we all should have a voice, have a view, have a say, and you know, we should all be learning, especially about, you know, the Indigenous history, Indigenous people, our culture. Really should be looking towards Indigenous leadership and voices. And Yeah, and especially with media, because it's funded by industry and oil, and so they do want to make us look like criminals and terrorists, and like we're lazy and we're bums and we have nothing better to do, and we're getting welfare checks that Canada pays for. See, they don't even know that, no, you do not fund, Canadian government, taxpayers' dollars do not fund fund us or support us. And that people who are non-Indigenous benefit off of our stolen lands, benefit off our lives, benefit off our homelessness, everyone. Even though I know there are some people that have, migrated here under difficult circumstances and didn't have much choice, but they still benefit from Indigenous people. Just trying to be more sensitive towards that, but still it is what it is. And yeah.
For sure. Just like as a follow-up question to that, could you ever actually see a future where an Indigenous lens kind of becomes more of like a norm? And kind of like, how do you kind of envision us getting there?
Oh, yes, I definitely see that with people like Lee, who paved the way. I'm pretty sure that Lee really had to keep on trekking through, right? Like had to fight to where she is now, to have her voice heard and to be out there. And so people like her, people like Jayce, who are giving other people, who are giving voices to other people, to helping that. So we need to keep on working, keep on recognizing our gifts. I try to encourage people using their voice, using their gifts, whatever it may be, because we're all needed. We need our allies, our relatives to stand with us, because we can't do this on our own. And we're not going to kick you off Turtle Island, right? Like, and say, go home. We're all in this together right now. So we need to really kind of break down those barriers and whatever we can do to be heard.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Kind of springboarding off of that, Lee, in what ways do you think kind of your work as a storyteller and artist has kind of helped bring awareness to Indigenous issues as well as like climate change? And how has it kind of contributed to diversifying the climate conversation?
Me says, okay, this shows that I'll just do anything to try and talk to these people and get them to listen to what we're doing and saying. Because the performance storytelling came very, very late in life, with my kids pulling me into theater, and okay, I know how to do performance storytelling. I watched it, I witnessed it, I learned from my elders about it. And I think that there's a value in, I do this thing with Bill Coleman. I don't know if you know who he is, but I tell the flood story. And he's a tap dancer. And he's a tall, skinny white guy, but we just have a blast doing this little performance that we started in Greenland and we've been all over the place. And I really love doing it because it talks about our relations with the rest of humanity. And I know you mentioned it, Eve, that we don't want to throw anybody back home, away from us, because we know that we are related to you. There's an 8,000-year-old white guy they found in Passamaquoddy, Maine, and we're mixed up with them. There's Black people that came and witnessed the building of the pyramids and took that back to Africa. We're related to the Mexica, the Mexican people, and we're related to the Filipinos and the Ainus and the Micronesians, Melanesians, Polynesians. We're related to everybody. So we are one people under the earth. So I think that's one of the important things. So in my performance, I put that particular story together to show that we know something more than what everybody else knows. And we have stories that are older. These stories are actually older than they think we've been here. They say we've been here 15,000 years. Davenport is the oldest continuous use highway in the world. It is more than 15,000 years old. So, you know, you have to, they're finding bodies now at the bottom of the Pacific and in the Yucatan that are 40,000 years old from the pre-glacier days. We've been here a long time, and we've been careful about the environment all that time since the very first glaciation, because we thought we were being punished for abusing the earth. So we started making all these things about how we have to take care of the earth, how we have to make sure that we put everything back the way we found it. We cannot take more than we need. We cannot destroy things wantonly. And we have to be very, very careful. When that glacier melted, nobody thinks about this very much, but it came as a fireball from Takaranto, that's here, and it went sailing across the whole island right to Tawasan. And on the way, it uprooted all the trees of the prairies. That's why you have flatlands there, because they were burnt and they were destroyed. And it was to melt the ice. And then the rocks of the Canadian Shield were heated up, and that big honking fat piece of ice, the upper half, came screaming down and dug out the Great Lakes that you see today. So it changed this island completely, and it destroyed the lives of millions and millions and millions of humans, of animals, whales, all kinds of beings died in the course of that. And that's a smartening up pill, I tell you. You just have to take a look around and holy shit. And my mother always used to say, you treat your mother badly, she was going to give you a spanking. Well, the earth spankings are terrible. In the last 10 years, there has been more storms that have been extremely destructive than all the rest of so-called recorded history. We knew that at Siksika, when they started digging up the prairies, the people told them, if you do that, dig up the sage, you're going to lose the water and you're going to turn this prairie into a furnace, melting the ice up north. That was 1890. We had experience with these things. We had knowledge about these things. And I think you're right, Eve. We need belief. But racism doesn't allow for belief. Colonialism doesn't allow for us. They want our knowledge, and I know we all think that they're just starting to listen to us now. No, democracy comes from the Haudenosaunee. The Constitution of the Americans comes from the Haudenosaunee, and they thanked the Haudenosaunees in 1990 for it. They finally recognized that's where they got it. The whole business of environmentalism comes from this island, and all the knowledge about it comes from this island, but they don't want us, because then they can't take credit for it. We can say to them, look, my mother died without leaving one piece of garbage behind. Not one piece. She was a staunch environmentalist from before I was born, and she thought that environmentalists were so funny that they took credit for this stuff. I don't see how they could take credit for this stuff. It's so blindingly, painfully obvious that it didn't come from them. Even Karl Marx talks about us. You know, he's the great socialist we all love to hate. He talks about alienation from nature and natural man coming together once we get rid of the capitalists, and that's us. He very clearly says it's us. And he gets his theory from a guy named Morgan, who lived with the Haudenosaunee for 20 years. The knowledge that you're seeing about washing, the simple act of, do you know why we were called dirty Indians? Because we washed every day, took our clothes off and everything. How filthy is that, the Jesuits wrote. That's why we got that designation, because it was immoral. Queen Elizabeth I took all her clothes off and washed once a year. And she had to get confession over it because God saw her naked body. Well, think about that for just a minute. This is 1500. And so then all these women are dying of having babies from not washing. And they're saying, we want an Indian midwife because she's not going to kill me because she washed. That's how we got the designation Dirty Indian. So they've been taking our knowledge for a long time, but they don't want us because then they can just plunder the land at will. As long as we're here, it's very difficult for them to keep plundering the land. That's my contribution to all of this. Thank you.
Yeah, very well put. Truly fascinating stories. I love how you bring out kind of like how the glacier and how it kind of devastated everything was kind of the wake-up call.
Nice.
And there are things like that happening right now. And apparently that's not enough of a wake-up call for some governments out there. So let's hope some people smarten up, definitely.
Can I add just one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
The second part of the question was diversifying the climate conversation. I want to say that I got the first Chinese person published in this country, and I got other people published, and brought the conversation about the climate and environmentalism to people of color. I did that very, very many years ago, probably about 35 years ago. But I realized that, you know, I had my own racial biases about people of color. And it showed up this way. I asked this Chinese guy that I had just met, what do Chinese people do at a dance? He looked at me and says, we dance. And I realized how racist what I said was. And then I thought, oh, I have to move past this, and I have to go through it. And the only way through it is with Asian people. So Sky Lee wrote a book about my children's family. It's called Disappearing Moon Cafe, and became my close friend. And the other fellow, Jim Wong Chu, who's passed on now, he was the guy that I got published. And I became a close friend of his, and other African-American and African-Canadian writers. That's how diversity happens. You make relations with other people. You don't just sit there and talk about undoing racism from an armchair. You actually get out and do the work. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, very well put. I think it's definitely kind of been a hot button topic. I'm learning a lot of internalized biases over this last year. So thank you for that. So Lee, we're actually going to turn back to you again for our last section, for our future directions section.
Okay.
Our question for you is, compared to when you first kind of began your storytelling journey, how do you think the public's approach to Indigenous justice has changed over time, for the better or for the worse? And
I think it's changed way for the better. I know it doesn't seem like it, but here's the thing. I published 100,000 books by the time the Oka crisis happened, and 60,000 Canadians backed the Mohawks on the bridge during the Oka crisis. And most of those people, everybody was telling me, had read my work in some way or another, Bobby Lee, I Am Woman, and all this sort of stuff. And I know my conversations with Canadians has made a really big impact on a lot of young Canadians. And it's the younger Canadians, I think, that are more open, but especially people of color. When I was young, people of color, like climate, environment, like who cares? You know, that's sort of how it was going when I was younger. But now everybody's concerned about the environment, and everybody's concerned about where this country is going and what kind of Canada. The thing that's happened is this, is that people of color and Indigenous people have decided that this is their country too. And we don't want what's going on now. We want something different. We want something I think that has a lot to do with my storytelling, my writing, my speaking, you know, my antics. First thing I ever did was a fishing rights blockade in Washington State, where I'm originally from. They put us in Canada because my great-great-grandma married an Indigenous man from Canada. So they kicked us out of that's how I became Canadian. You know, I'm not really from Lummi in Washington. But anyhow, that becomes the road to diversity, is that we are entitled to something good. And the good life is what it's all about. Living a good life, not having trinkets that you find in a grocery store, you know, plastic everything. And that. No, it's having a good life, eating good food, standing on good land, breathing good air, having a good sleep. All these things are important. And it takes fighting against the current climate destruction to get that and keep that for our children and our grandchildren. I want to say this, one last thing. The 7 generations model, that's Christian. I hope you know that. Because mine is my grandchildren to infinity. That's what we're responsible for. To the end of time, we're responsible for this earth. But I do like that 7 generation. It makes it a little easier to kind of wrap your mind around. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very well put. So we're going to move to Jayce now. You did kind of mention earlier how in your work with food sovereignty, how you kind of like adapt Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and with more like colonial policy and trying to like reconcile that. So what is in your experience, what role does this kind of cross-cultural communication play in the fight for true climate justice?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think it's a smart one for you know, non-Indigenous or people that aren't from Canada to notice. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but if you're a guest in a territory, like for example, I'm a guest in Coast Salish territories, and as a guest, I have responsibilities to uphold the rights of those people and to respect the rights of those peoples. So, you know, for everyone that's a guest on our territories in Canada or wherever you are, it's important to recognize those relationships. Who are the first peoples of this territory? Yeah. You know, my mom always asks a really important question, because water is really important in my culture. Do you know where your water comes from? The water from your tap, do you know where that comes from? Can you identify, you know, what Indigenous peoples were displaced from your territory? And it was I'm not going to lie, it took me a couple months to find out some detail of this territory, because like there just wasn't much online. It actually took me getting outside. I know it's COVID, but I met someone on the street, which is so random. And he started telling me all of the things of this territory. And I think I just want to mention, you know, the IAJ project has done some workshops with folks. Where were they from? They were from India, and I thought it was a really great experience, and the feedback was also they really appreciated it. This workshop was focused on building connections like that and sharing stories. So, you know, I shared the recreation story, the flood story with them, and they were explaining how, oh yeah, we have a similar story like that, and helping them realize that, you know, we have similarities and similar ideas that we can work together to make, you know, Canada or even just the world a better place. So I think building those connections is super key, especially for the fight in climate justice, because I was able to kind of explain, you know, why it's so important for Indigenous voices to lead that movement, and why it is so important for everybody to do the work and show up in the way that they can, you know, because we all have a role. We're all here on Mother Earth. Whether you call that Turtle Island in Canada or whatever term you use for our territories, we all have responsibilities to this territory. And if you're a guest, a big part of your responsibility is to know who was displaced there, why they were displaced. You know, I also welcome you to do some research into the genocidal policies that have been enforced on our people. You know, the Indian Act was super oppressive. And I think it was, someone was talking about the pass system. That's another example. There's so many when you start looking into it, and it's very daunting. And I just want to note that it's okay to feel guilty. And, you know, like even when I'm going through it, I'm doing a research, like I'm researching a timeline for ICA, and it's even taking a toll on me to go through and read like how my family and my ancestors were treated back then. And but also it's also a sign of wellness and resilience to know that, you know, we're all still here, and people like Lee and Eve and all of the other Indigenous peoples that are doing this work are still doing it, and they're still doing it in a good way. And I think, you know, it is important for our cultures to make those connections so that we can support each other to just make, you know, our environment healthier and safer. And I just want to note that it's important to recognize how important the environment is to us, and how important the waters and the lands and the animals is to us, because to me, you know, that's why I do what I do. It is for future generations, but it is also for those beings that can't speak up for themselves in the same way that we can communicate, because it is part of my role, my understanding from my teachings, it is part of my role as an Indigenous person to advocate for those beings so that they can also live that good life and fulfill their responsibilities that they have. Thanks.
Wow, yeah, definitely. I totally agree with kind of that recognition of like this collective responsibility that kind of everyone has for this land and the relationships with each other. So I think like, thank you for all of the super important kind of like outreach and like awareness work that you're also doing. So our last question of the day, for our prepared questions anyway, is for Eve. In February last year, you spoke at a panel where you drew attention to the GSL dispute so that the next generation can stop the cycle of violence against Indigenous peoples. From that same panel, you have also said reconciliation is dead. In your perspective, how could the government kind of take correct steps towards proper reconciliation in the future, if any? How can the government truly take action to protect Indigenous lands and the environment compared to what it's currently doing?
Land back, land back, land back, land back. Reconciliation. You know, I think like a lot of like mainstream Canadians think that there's like this two-way road with reconciliation, but it's with Canada and mainstream Canadians and their relationship to us. Like I said before, is that everyone benefits off stolen lands, off stolen lives, off stolen children, Indigenous children. And so reconciliation is for us. It's not that we didn't become racist to ourselves. We didn't give ourselves status cards. We didn't put ourselves in residential school. We didn't put ourselves on the reserve. So it's not for, you know, it's not us to act on, you know, trying to build a relationship with Canada. It's Canada to try to build its relationship with us. And it can start by getting off our lands, by getting industry, stop letting industry steal lands and go through our territories, because every time industry goes through our lands, it gets smaller, smaller, smaller. Like I said before, Wet'suwet'en territories is a police state, and it's a heavily police state, especially since CGL is continuing its work. Now Molly and Jen and the matriarchs, Freda, can't go and do ceremony on their own territory without the police coming and stopping them. And so again, we're seeing the past where it's illegal to have ceremony. You're like trying to do ceremony at the end of a barrel of a gun. My father can't even have a smokehouse on his territory without RCMP going heavily armed and going in to the smokehouse. Like we can't even be traditional on our lands. My father can't even go on his lands and be traditional and show and do his responsibility to the land and show my siblings and show his granddaughters And so another thing too, the RCMP, when I was arrested, they wanted me to sign conditions that I will not be allowed back to the territory. I will not be allowed back to Gidimt'en. And that if I'm with Wet'suwet'en, the only way I can go back is for traditional and spiritual practices or ways. So who gets to define that? The RCMP. That's what they're saying. So again, we are placed back into when it was illegal to do this. And who gets to say? They are trying to have control and power over our bodies, over our spirit. They're trying to have control. So this is what injunctions do. This is what industry does to Indigenous people. This is why it is genocide, because we are going to have more missing and murdered Indigenous women. Our children are going to be sex trafficked. We can't even practice ceremony without having a gun pointed at our heads. So I really think reconciliation is dead, and they don't want to reconcile that. They don't want it to be live. They're going to tell lies. They're going to fabricate it. All these smoke and mirrors. They're going to tell whatever mainstream Canada wants to hear and feel good about themselves so that they can sleep at night and not have to worry about us. We can go back to being ignored. I know I'm a little bit harsh, but that's because my people keep on dying in the healthcare system, just trying to get better. Their lives are on the line and they get injected full of morphine and die. Our children are being birth alert and getting taken. That was my biggest fear of my baby getting taken because I stood on the front line. Or there's a lot of people, Indigenous people are scared to go to the healthcare system or to get stopped by the RCMP too as well. Look at the pandemic happened, but the killings at the hands of the RCMP did not stop. More of our people murdered by the RCMP than COVID deaths. I remember at one point in the pandemic, but I mean, until all these things are looked at and are starting to heal, our people can heal and be free and not have to live under these circumstances, then there might be some reconciliation. But until that, then I don't think so, because they benefit. Canada benefits, and they will never take that hold off. I'm sorry, I don't want to be doom and gloom, but we have hope. We have people doing this good work, strong Indigenous people putting their lives on the line, using their voice. We have the next generation. I'm going to teach my daughter to use her voice. She's going to be a fighter. She's going to be a warrior. She's going to know white supremacy. She's going to call out her racist teachers. And she's going to teach her little friends, you know, what's right and what's wrong. You know, I have hope, and there is hope, and, you know, we got to keep on fighting. That's all there is to it. We need our allies. We need our people. So, you know, when college ends, please, I encourage you to keep on this work, because most of our lives, it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop at college. We're not afforded that luxury.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Kind of echoing what Jayce said kind of near the beginning of the panel. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us. I know it can be definitely takes a toll on mental health, and it takes a lot to be able to share all of this anger. And like many of us said before, we just cannot move forward until Canada recognizes that this is genocide and this is causing profound Indigenous suffering. So thank you for sharing that with us. On that note, we will actually take audience questions. So if any audience members have any questions they would like to send into the chat, please do so now. And we have around 10 or 15 minutes to take those up.
I have some more questions. One's for Eve and one's for me. You know,
Yeah.
what's that
We
about?
just had some questions prepared in case audience members didn't ask any.
Okay.
But I'll give like another maybe like 10 seconds in case some people are still typing their questions out. But otherwise, yeah, we can definitely go with those. Okay. Yeah, so I guess one of the questions that we were also curious about that we weren't too sure if we would have time for it during the panel itself is, this is kind of open to anyone who wants to jump in. And I know Jayce also touched on this earlier, but what can be said kind of about the role of education, whether it's, you know, within the same generation or cross generations, for achieving justice towards environmental and Indigenous issues?
Okay, well, you know, Sinker always says education got us into this mess and education will get us out. So that's the first thing that we can do. And I think I don't want to get into a debate with you, but we have a ceremony called Reconcile Yourself to Yourself, and we've had this ceremony for 15,000 years. So I hope it's not dead because it's a big part of my life. So what is reconciliation? Well, if you're colonized, it's pushing back on colonialism if you're the colonized. And if you want to be an ally, it's helping me push back on colonialism. And then we can reconcile. I don't give a shit about reconciling with the Canadian government. I want to topple them. So I don't see how it can be dead. It just depends how you're looking at it and who you want to reconcile with. When I was a child, every Canadian kid beat me up for going to public school. That doesn't happen anymore. Thanks to a whole lot of reconciliation work on my part in the field of education, and saying you aren't going to beat our kids anymore, because I will come there with a bigger stick. Not scared of any of you. You see, so it's not anger like you think it is. It's grim determination. It is absolute grim determination. I am not leaving this world until I push back on that horrible tide called white male supremacy and colonization. We're going to have a place in this world by the time I leave. And they tell me that it's, you know, I only got about 25 years left. So we better get going, girls. That's it. That's my last contribution.
Yep. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we actually got a few questions in the chat. One of them is, how do our speakers feel about the language of decolonization being taken up by colonial institutions? For, like, as has been said and advocated by many, decolonization is not a metaphor and requires action, particularly land back. So how do speakers feel about, for example, university departments trying to decolonize their curriculum?
Yeah, I want to say something about that. Oh, God, I didn't want to do this, but decolonization is about the land, not about the university. So you can take the racism out of education in the university and take the pro-colonial sentiment out of the teaching at the university, but it's the land that the decolonization is about. So we should be clear about that. Give us back the land. Get off the land. I think you said it, Eve. When we get things muddled up like that, you get this mulligan stew that makes no sense whatsoever. So one of the roles I play at University of Toronto is getting people straight on that. No, you don't decolonize a course. You take the racism and the sexism and the, you know, white male supremacy out of it, but you don't decolonize a course. You decolonize the land. This is the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon to me. And let's just start with that, and let's push Canada to recognize that and to acknowledge that and to stop in preventing us from using our own land. So that's the way I see it. And that's, to me, reconciliation work from the point of view of the person who's got someone else's foot on theirs. Get off my damn foot. Or, as Eve says, get off the land. It's ours.
Very
I'd
well
like to add
put.
to that.
Yep.
Really
Yeah, go ahead.
quickly. It kind of, you made me think of something that I've heard a lot of people talk about in my community, is that there's some people that say that it's not possible to decolonize curriculum because curriculum itself is so colonial and it's so like it's just so different than the way that we used to teach our people. So I just wanted to note that I think we kind of, as Indigenous people, can maintain our own ways of education, which we have, you know, going out on the land, decolonizing the land is definitely part of it, and teaching our youth and our young people and anyone of any age that kind of style of education, because, you know, storytelling is education. Our language, the way that we speak and where that knowledge comes from, it holds knowledge as well. So even learning the language is a form of education. So just noticing that it's so different when you come from an Indigenous perspective when you're looking at education. It's not so much about testing and that very rigorous style. It's more about what are you retaining, what are you learning, and also how are you feeling while you're learning that, recognizing our emotional well-being in education and how ceremony plays in education, because there's just so many different ways that we educate ourselves as Indigenous peoples, even dreams, you know, just noticing that that's such a fundamental difference that I've heard a lot of people say that it's just not even possible to decolonize the curriculum itself, just because of how fundamentally different our education systems are.
For sure. Thank you both for answering that question. Hope that was good, Sydney. Our next question is...
Oh, can I add something onto that?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Okay, so just adding on to what Lee and Jayce had already mentioned, for me about decolonizing in the academic, it's such a like someone said before, it's such a colonial structure, right? And it's also like a lot of people who benefit from are like white cis males, and also like I think because of like the institute that where they get their funding too, like I know there's been some controversy because like, you know, some universities want to, you know, think about climate justice or decolonize, and some of the students are like, well, hey, you know, you get some of your funding from big oil, or you are trying to drill that on top of that sacred mountain in Hawaii. And it's like, you know, they won't pull out, they won't excuse my language, mess up their funding. So it's like, you know, if you want to talk about decolonizing, you got to walk your talk, really, right? So I mean, also it's a very I guess you can say, like, not all of it, because I don't obviously know, but I know that, you know, university can be a very racist or biased, like, institute. And also, like, because of our history and them like writing our history for us. So it's like, okay, you want to decolonize, you know, you take back all those lies, like, you know, you're telling children, or like growing up in, and even in the Toronto school boards, right, all that like just focusing on the fur trade, blah blah blah, right, and not focusing on like the truth of anything. So it's really hypocritical, and I don't think they can really achieve decolonizing spaces. I know that like there's cool equity classes and programs out there, but I know that also they probably struggle with the university on some content of their course like that they're trying to teach. Or you know, there's what do you call it, some, I don't know, but it's just, I know that they have some issues there. So I just wanted to add that for whatever reason.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. U of T especially has been especially stubborn in kind of the fossil fuel divestment campaign, as many of our audience members probably know. For example, like last December, we were attending kind of this address about U of T's like climate charter, and we were asking them like how do they feel about having their investments in the fossil fuel industry, and how do they feel about that industry fundamentally being detrimental to land and like human beings and life, and that was just never addressed. So again, going back to the whole like institutions are just trying to manipulate narratives and, you know, sweep things under the rug. So totally get that.
Also,
Yeah.
can I add on to that?
Mhm.
You know, a lot of people value academics, right? Like they think that they have like a PhD on the end of their name, and, you know, that they know everything, and that Indigenous knowledge ain't recognized or isn't valued as the same as academic. And for example, like, you know, you can study psychology, become a psychologist, but you're just a textbook psychologist or counselor if you haven't had lived experience, or, you know, how, I don't know. I kind of lost my thought there, but I mean, I'm just saying, I know that like a lot of people, you know, just because I haven't like gone to university or completed it, like my knowledge, or I'm not as valuable as a person as maybe some of my colleagues.
Yeah,
So-
definitely. There's, I think, a lot to be said about kind of like what is valued and what isn't, and different like ways of knowing and like contextualizing like the world, I guess, and like what is valued and what isn't is also inherently very racist and among other things. So yeah.
My mother used to say, I want to say this to you, Eve. She used to say, oh, so-and-so, so-and-so, BS, MS, PhD. Oh, well, everybody knows what BS is. And MS means more the same. And PhD, well, that's piled high and deep. She didn't think much of education either.
Fair enough.
It's good to have though.
Yeah. Our last question, I think, for the day will be from Carly. She is a child and youth care worker, and she is aware of the ways that Indigenous children are treated in healthcare systems and other sorts of systems like these. Do you think there's anything she can do as an individual and as a privileged white settler to work to stop perpetuating that oppression?
Yeah, I do actually. Restore the right to raise our children to Indigenous people. It's the same as get off our land and close the RCMP down. You know, we're not using the internet very well. I'm surprised at Canadians how thick skulled sometimes you can all be. But if the 30 million people that say they support us, or however many millions you are, send out a 5 minutes worth of emails to every MP every week and said, get out of Indian country, get off, you know, stop taking our kids from us and get off our land. I'm sure that Canada would have to do something at some point because it would be so annoying just to stop. But Canadians don't think of doing things like that. So you need to be a better ally, than a more thoughtful ally than you're being. You know, I just really believe that. Show me something. Show me something. I'm 70 years old.
Any of our other speakers want to add to that? Yes, Eve, go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to say this. I say this with, you know, with love in my heart. You're asking us to do the work for you. You are making us, you're asking us, what can you do? But you should be doing that work instead of trying to get us to do the work, to think of answers, to tell you to help us. So that is exhausting. That is exhausting. We are tired. We are tired of fighting the system. We are tired of surviving. We are tired. And, you know, we need you to do that work. We need you to do that work and to educate yourself and to think, what can I contribute? You have gifts. You know your gifts. We don't know your gifts. So I leave you with that.
Yeah, I think this woman named CJ, who's a Jerome, as in Harry Jerome, the runner, but she said, "I gave up my daisy apron. Do your own work." And I like that. That's exactly what I believe. Do some thinking. Do something. Show us something.
Fantastic. Jayce, any last comments?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Eve. It was in the back of my mind and I wanted to mention it just for everyone that's listening to notice that when you are asking Indigenous people to participate in things like this, that it's really important to be mindful of what you're asking them. And, why are you asking these things? And if you are going to take that time out, I've seen a lot of people saying it's really important to compensate folks, because it is very exhausting for us to constantly be talking about the trauma that we've experienced for thousands of generations, or however long it's been. And it's not easy. Like, for some folks, it's really not easy. Some have that gift, right? Like Eve was saying, we all have our individual gifts. As humans, we all have gifts. So it is your role as a human to figure out what that gift is and how you can apply that to your life. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I think it's really important that you are mindful of what you're asking of Indigenous folks when you're asking these kinds of questions and what kind of harm that could do to them when you're asking it.
For sure. Yeah, so on that last note, thank you all so much for this amazing discussion, and to the audience members for attending this webinar. The discussion was absolutely fantastic, and it definitely didn't feel like it was 2 hours. I personally enjoyed this quite a lot and learned so much. So thank you again to Eve, Jayce, and Lee for taking the time and having the capacity to be able to join us tonight and sharing your thoughts and your experiences. I really enjoyed definitely moderating this. So in case audience members and speakers alike want to rewatch the webinar, it was recorded and a video with closed captions will be up on our YouTube channel soon. We will also compile all of the resources that were mentioned during the discussion into a document, and we will share that on our social media platforms. So to make sure that you see this video and the resource document once they're up, please follow UC-Lit Sustainability on Facebook and Sustainability UC-Lit on Instagram. Our chat mods will send, yes, they have our handles into the chat once again. And one last time, just to plug us, because we are always looking for more friends. If you're a U of T student interested in doing direct climate action work, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be hosting more events like this throughout the school year, or next month because school year is almost over, and we welcome anyone in helping us out. So once again, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists and everyone on our team, and I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. Thank you.
Thank you, gals. You're
Thank
so
you.
Bye-bye. Maybe I'll see you on the taxi.
Yeah, bye. See ya.